They didn't sell her because she was weak. They sold her because she reminded them what they feared most. The auction hall pulsed with low violet light, the air humming at a steady 60 cycles per second from the overhead generators, casting long metallic reflections across polished floors as buyers whispered in coded bids. But at the center of it all, she sat motionless on a levitating slab, Liara Vexis, her silver-blue skin faintly luminous under the cold lights, her posture upright despite the absence below her waist where mobility had once defined her strength, her expression unreadable, not broken, not pleading, just distant, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment long before anyone else realized it. Ethan Cole hadn't come here for anything alive. His boots still dusted with carbon residue from a failing engine 3 decks below, his hands stained with oil that no cleanser ever quite removed. He was here for parts, something small, something practical, something he could fix, because fixing things made sense. Unlike the quiet tension crawling through the room as the auctioneer's voice rose and fell like a mechanical tide. Lot 72. The voice echoed. Non-operational asset. Minimal value. Opening bid. But Ethan wasn't listening to the numbers. He was looking at her eyes. Not glowing like the others. Not scanning. Not calculating. Just watching. As if she already knew how this would end. And somehow that stillness unsettled him more than any threat. Display ever could. A man beside him chuckled under his breath, muttering about wasted credits and defective lineage, and the word defective hung in the air longer than it should have, like a system error no one bothered to correct. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing back at the terminal in his hand, a simple parts list blinking up at him, one missing component standing between him and a working ship, one problem he could solve, one outcome he could control, but his thumb hesitated over the screen as the bid counter flickered, slowing, stalling, no one else stepping forward. The auctioneer's tone dipped, impatience creeping in, ready to close, ready to discard. And in that exact second, Liara's gaze shifted, not toward the crowd, not toward the exit, but straight toward him, not asking, not begging, just seeing him, like he was the last variable left in an equation she had already solved. Ethan exhaled, a quiet, almost frustrated breath, and tapped the screen. The sound was small, barely audible over the hum, but it cut through everything. A confirmation tone echoing back from the system. Heads turned, murmurs followed. Confusion more than anything else, because this wasn't a strategic purchase. It wasn't logical, it didn't fit. The auctioneer blinked once, then forced a smile, declaring the sale with rehearsed enthusiasm that didn't quite hide the surprise. Ethan lowered his hand, already questioning the decision, already calculating what he'd just traded away, but when he looked back at Liara, nothing in her expression had changed, except one thing, something subtle, almost imperceptible, the faintest shift in the way she held her shoulders, like a structure that had decided, quietly, not to collapse. And as the restraints disengaged with a soft mechanical hiss, Ethan realized something he couldn't quantify, couldn't fix, couldn't explain. He hadn't just bought something broken. He had interrupted something that was meant to end. The transport clamps released with a hollow metallic click as Ethan guided his ship away from the station, the low vibration of the engines settling into a steady rhythm beneath his boots, a familiar sound that usually meant control, but tonight it felt different, heavier somehow, like the ship was carrying more than its weight in cargo. He did not look back at the auction bay as it shrank behind him, just kept his eyes on the dim stars ahead while the navigation panel flickered in soft blue light, recalculating a route he had flown 100 times before, except now there was a presence behind him that did not belong to any system or checklist. Liara had not spoken since the restraints disengaged, her levitating slab now locked into the cargo bay's support grid, stabilized by a field Ethan had patched together from spare components, not elegant, not permanent, but functional, and that was enough for now. He crouched beside the control panel, tightening a loose connector with a worn tool, the faint scent of heated circuitry mixing with engine oil, grounding him in something real, something he understood, because machines made sense, they broke for reasons, they responded to effort, they did not look at you like they already knew the outcome. Behind him, there was only silence, not tense, not fearful, just still. and that silence pressed against the back of his mind until he finally turned. Liara was watching him again. Not with curiosity, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet focus that felt almost clinical, like she was studying a pattern rather than a person. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth that had seen better days, and walked closer, stopping just outside what he considered respectful distance, about 3 feet, enough space for choice, something he suspected she had not been given in a long time. The soft hum of the stabilizer field filled the gap between them. "You are not required to stay there," he said, his voice steady, not commanding, not offering more than the words themselves, and he reached past her, adjusting the field to allow lateral movement, giving her control over her position within the limited space. She did not move immediately, only shifted her gaze to the control node, then back to him, measuring, calculating, and for a moment Ethan wondered if he had made a mistake, if giving freedom too quickly could be as unsettling as taking it away. Seconds stretched, marked only by the faint ticking of a cooling conduit along the wall, until the slab responded, gliding a few inches to the side, smooth, deliberate, not testing the system, but confirming it. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to her, and stepped back toward the workbench, pulling out a compact frame of alloy parts, the beginnings of something that was not on his original parts list. He set it down with care, aligning pieces by habit, already thinking in measurements, in load distribution, in balance, because if something was broken, you did not stare at it, you built something that worked. "This will take time," he said without looking up, not expecting a response, but offering the truth anyway, because truth was the only currency he trusted. Behind him, the silence shifted, not louder, not softer, just different, like the absence of something had been replaced by a question that had not yet been asked. Liara's voice, when it finally came, was low and even, carrying a tone that did not belong to defeat or gratitude, but something far more dangerous, something aware. "Why did you interrupt it?" she asked. "Not why did you buy me, not why did you help, but why did you stop what was meant to happen?" Ethan paused, the tool in his hand hovering over an unfinished joint, and for a brief moment the hum of the ship seemed to fade, leaving only that question hanging in the air, precise and unavoidable. He exhaled slowly, setting the tool down with a soft metallic tap, and answered without turning around, "Because some answers were easier when you were not being watched. Because I have seen what happens when no one does," he said. Simple, unpolished, not an explanation, just a fact. And as the engines carried them further from the station, something in the space between them changed. Not trust, not yet, but the first fracture in the idea that this moment would end the way it was supposed to. The ship settled into cruise velocity at 120,000 miles per hour, the stars stretching into thin lines across the forward display, while the internal systems dimmed to a low operational glow, conserving power the way Ethan always preferred when he was working with limited resources. The cargo bay felt smaller now, not because of space, but because every movement carried awareness, every sound measured, every silence noticed, and Ethan found himself adjusting his routine. Without meaning to, placing tools down more carefully, checking readouts twice, as if something about her presence required precision beyond mechanics. The alloy frame on the workbench had taken shape into something recognizable, a skeletal structure with articulated joints, compact but reinforced, built to support weight without wasting energy, each segment balanced within fractions of an inch, because if it was going to hold her, it had to hold everything she had left. Liara had not moved far from where he enabled her control, the levitating slab now positioned near the wall, angled just enough to observe without being in the way, though Ethan suspected she chose that position deliberately, not to avoid him, but to see more. Her eyes followed the construction, not with curiosity alone, but with analysis, as if she understood the logic behind every connection, every weld, every adjustment. "You build like you expect failure," she said at last, her voice cutting through the steady hum of the ship, not accusatory, not dismissive, just precise. Ethan did not look up immediately, tightening a joint until it clicked into place, then checking the tension with a practiced hand. "I build like it matters if it breaks," he replied, reaching for a calibration tool and aligning the lower supports, his movements efficient, controlled. The kind of control that came from experience rather than confidence. Liara's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, as if that answer carried more information than it should have. Most would not invest this much effort into something they consider temporary, she said. And this time, there was something else in her tone. Not doubt, not challenge, but a test, as if she was placing his actions against a system of logic that did not account for them. Ethan paused again, just for a second, the faint ticking of a cooling conduit echoing in the pause. And then he resumed, connecting the central support frame with steady hands. Then it is a good thing I do not consider it temporary, he said simply, not turning, not explaining further, because explanations were unreliable. But structure could be seen, could be touched, could be proven. The stabilizer field flickered slightly as the ship adjusted course by a fraction of a degree, a minor correction, but enough to shift the light across Liara's skin, catching the faint luminescence beneath the surface, like something alive beneath glass. She watched the frame on the table, then the distance between it and herself, calculating, mapping, understanding what it was meant to become. You intend for me to stand, she said, not a question, just an observation. And for the first time, there was a trace of something unguarded beneath her composure. Not hope, not yet, but the recognition of possibility. Ethan set the final piece of the lower assembly into place and stepped back, wiping his hands slowly, the cloth dragging across metal-stained skin. I intend for you to have the option, he answered, meeting her gaze now, not challenging, not softening, just steady, because options were the only thing he could offer that had not already been taken from her. The ship hummed around them, system steady, course locked, distance from the station increasing with every second. But inside that small cargo bay, something shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, like a system recalibrating without announcing it. Liara's eyes moved from the frame to him, holding there a moment longer than before, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, quieter, but more certain. Options are inefficient, she said, almost to herself, as if repeating a principle she had lived by. And then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, she added, but they are interesting. And Ethan did not respond, did not need to, because for the first time since the sale, the outcome no longer felt predetermined. The first time the frame powered on, it did not make a dramatic sound, just a low mechanical hum that settled into the ship's existing rhythm, as if it had always been part of it. Ethan adjusted the voltage by a fraction, watching the indicator stabilize at a clean 12 volts, enough to support motion without overloading the improvised system. His fingers steady despite the quiet tension in his chest. Because this part mattered more than the build, this part decided whether the idea would hold. Liara observed without speaking, her position unchanged but her attention sharpened, tracking every movement of his hands, every adjustment, as if she were mapping the machine into memory before ever touching it. It will not be perfect, Ethan said, not as a warning, not as an apology, just a statement of fact. And he stepped back, giving her a clear path to the frame, the stabilizer field lowering with a soft hiss as the support released her from its hold. For a moment, nothing happened. The ship continued its quiet travel through empty space, systems steady, lights dim, and in that stillness, the distance between intention and action stretched longer than either of them expected. Liara's gaze moved from the frame to the floor beneath it, then back again, calculating angles, pressure points, the unknown variables that no system could fully predict. Failure is likely, she said calmly, not to discourage, but to define the outcome in terms she understood, probabilities instead of emotion. Ethan nodded once, leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed loosely, not moving to assist, not reaching out, because this had to be hers. So is success, he replied, his voice even, leaving the balance between those two words entirely in her control. Another second passed, then another, marked only by the faint ticking of cooling metal somewhere behind the wall panel, until finally Liara moved. It was not sudden, not hesitant, but deliberate, her body shifting forward with careful precision, her hands gripping the upper frame, testing its stability, feeling the resistance, the structure, the possibility that it could hold. The first lift was minimal, barely an inch. the system responding with a soft adjustment as the weight distribution recalibrated. And Ethan watched the readouts from the corner of his eye, numbers fluctuating but holding within tolerance. Liara paused there, suspended between what she had been and what she might become, her expression unchanged, but the tension in her shoulders telling a different story, one that had nothing to do with mechanics. It responds, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. And then she shifted again, increasing the pressure, allowing the frame to take more of her weight, the servos adjusting in smooth increments, supporting, compensating, holding. The movement was small, measured in inches, but it changed the geometry of the moment entirely, her perspective rising just enough to alter the angle of the room, the horizon of her world expanding by degrees instead of miles. Ethan did not step forward, did not speak, his hands resting loosely at his sides, because this was not something he could fix or guide, only witness. Liara's eyes lifted, not to the frame, not to the floor, but forward, aligning with a level she had not occupied in a long time. And for the briefest moment, something in her composure fractured, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to let something else through, something quieter, something unfamiliar. The system held, the frame steady, the ship continuing its silent path through the void. And in that narrow space between balance and motion, Liara stood, not fully, not perfectly, but undeniably. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle shift, as if the word itself required recalibration. I see differently from here, she said. And Ethan exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding, because it was not about standing, not really. It was about what standing allowed. And as the hum of the frame blended with the ship's steady pulse, something fundamental had changed, not in the machine, but in the outcome it no longer guaranteed. The frame did not fail, and that alone was enough to change the rhythm of the room. Liara remained upright longer than the system was originally designed to support, the servos compensating with soft micro-adjustments measured in fractions of a second, each correction precise, controlled, almost instinctive, as if the machine was learning her as much as she was learning it. Ethan monitored the output from the side panel, numbers holding steady within acceptable variance, though he knew the real test was not the hardware. It was what came after, because standing was not the end, it was the beginning of something far less predictable. Liara shifted her weight again, a deliberate motion this time, testing not just balance but intention, her hands loosening their grip on the upper supports for a brief moment before re-engaging, confirming what she could trust and what she could not. It adapts, she said quietly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the frame, not as a user, but as someone evaluating a system's potential. Ethan nodded once, stepping closer, but not within reach, maintaining that same careful distance he had kept since the beginning, because proximity implied control, and control was not what this was about. It responds to you. He corrected, his voice even, and he adjusted a dial on the side panel, increasing responsiveness by a small margin, just enough to give her more precision without risking instability. The change was subtle, but Liara noticed immediately, her posture aligning with the shift, her movements becoming more fluid, less mechanical, as if the boundary between her and the machine was beginning to blur. Seconds stretched into minutes, the ship continuing its silent path through open space, the stars outside unmoving in their distant patterns, while inside, something far more significant was unfolding in inches and degrees. Liara released one hand from the frame, then the other, standing supported only by the lower structure, her body held in alignment by the system's calculated strength. And for the first time, there was no hesitation in her movement, only focus. She took a step, small, measured, the frame responding with a smooth forward motion, the sound barely audible beneath the ship's steady hum. But the impact of it was unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, not enough to interrupt the moment, but enough to mark it. Liara paused after that single step, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, her gaze lifting slightly as if recalibrating her understanding of space itself. Distance feels different, she said, her tone thoughtful, almost analytical, as if she was describing a shift in physics rather than experience. Ethan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, not visible, not meant to be seen, because this was not his moment to claim. It always does when you can move through it, he replied, and he returned his attention to the control panel, making minor adjustments that did not draw attention to themselves, ensuring the system would hold under continued use. Liara took another step, then another, each one more certain than the last, her movements no longer defined by limitation, but by choice, and that distinction changed everything. The silence between them was no longer empty, it carried weight, meaning, a shared understanding that did not require explanation. After several measured steps, Liara stopped, turning slightly toward him, her eyes studying him with a different intensity than before, not clinical, not detached, but something closer to recognition. "You do not observe like the others," she said, her voice quieter now, but more certain, as if she had reached a conclusion she could not ignore. Ethan did not look up immediately, tightening a final connector before answering, because some truths were easier to speak when his hands were occupied. "The others already decided what they were looking at," he said, his tone steady, unembellished, and when he finally met her gaze, there was no expectation there, no need for acknowledgement, just the same grounded presence he had offered from the start. Liara held that look for a moment longer than before, and something in her posture shifted again, not physically this time, but in a way that changed how she occupied the space, as if the concept of being seen had altered her more than the ability to stand ever could. And as the ship carried them further into the quiet dark, the distance between what she had been and what she was becoming continued to grow with every step she chose to take. The ship's internal clock marked 6 hours since the first successful step. Though time inside the cargo bay no longer felt linear, it moved in adjustments, in calibrations, in the quiet evolution of something that had not existed before. Liara no longer stood in place. She moved, not quickly, not carelessly, but with growing precision, each step measured in inches and intent, the frame responding with less correction, less resistance, as if it had begun to anticipate her rather than react to her. Ethan remained at the periphery, hands occupied with minor refinements that did not truly require his attention, because the system was stable now, but he understood that stability was not the same as readiness, and readiness was what came next. The ship hummed steadily at a cruising speed just under 140,000 miles per hour, its course locked toward a sector Ethan had not originally planned to visit, a decision made quietly, without announcement, but reflected in the navigation display that now pulsed with a different destination. Liara noticed, she always noticed. "You altered the trajectory," she said, her voice carrying that same controlled clarity, though there was a new layer beneath it now, something less distant, more engaged. Ethan did not deny it, did not reach for justification. He simply adjusted a panel, securing a loose conduit with a firm twist. Before answering, "Yes," he said, the word unadorned, sufficient. Liara took another step, turning slightly to face the forward section of the ship, her posture aligned, balanced, no longer defined by the need to compensate. "This path does not lead to a trade route or repair station," she continued, her gaze shifting toward the dim navigation glow, reading data she had no direct interface with, but understanding it anyway. Ethan leaned back against the workbench, arms loosely crossed, his eyes briefly meeting hers before drifting to the display. "No," he replied. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried calculation, layers of inference building behind her steady expression. "It leads toward controlled space," she said, not questioning, not accusing, simply defining. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible beneath the ship's steady systems. "It leads somewhere you might want to go," he said, and this time there was a slight shift in his tone, not uncertainty, but recognition of what that statement implied. Liara did not respond immediately, her gaze holding on him longer than before, searching not for deception, but for intent, and finding something that did not align with any pattern she had been taught to expect. "You assume I would return," she said, her voice quieter now, though no less precise. Ethan shook his head once, a small motion, almost dismissive. "I do not assume," he said, and then after a brief pause, he added, "I just do not remove the option." The words settled between them, heavier than before, because they carried consequence. Liara turned away slightly, her steps slower now, not from limitation, but from thought, the frame moving with her like an extension rather than a tool. She stopped near the viewing panel, where the distant stars stretched across the black, unchanging and vast. My father did not remove options, she said after a moment, her tone neutral, though the implication beneath it was not. He defined them until only one remained. Ethan did not interrupt, did not offer commentary, because this was not something that needed to be fixed. Liara's reflection shimmered faintly in the panel, her form upright, aligned, no longer matching the memory she carried of herself. He called it efficiency. She continued, her voice softer now, almost reflective. A system without uncertainty. Ethan pushed off the workbench, stepping closer, but still maintaining that careful distance, his boots quiet against the metal floor. Systems without uncertainty break the first time something changes, he said, his tone steady, grounded in experience rather than theory. Liara's eyes shifted slightly, not turning fully toward him, but acknowledging the statement. And you believe I am that change, she said. Ethan paused, considering, not the answer, but the weight of it. I believe you already were, he said finally, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no attempt to convince, just the same simple certainty he had carried from the moment he did not look away. The ship continued forward, silent, constant, carrying them closer to a place neither of them had fully defined yet, and for the first time, Liara did not question the direction, not because she trusted it, but because she was beginning to understand that direction was something she could choose again, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more impact than any destination ever could. The first alert did not come as a sound, but as a change in the ship's rhythm, a subtle fluctuation in the engine's hum that Ethan noticed before any system flagged it, his head lifting slightly as his eyes moved to the navigation panel, where a faint amber indicator pulsed once every 2 seconds, steady, deliberate, not an error but a signal. Liara felt it too, not through machinery but through the shift in his posture. The way his focus narrowed without tension, controlled, prepared, and she turned from the viewing panel, her movements now fluid enough that the frame beneath her responded like an extension of her will. We are no longer alone, she said, not as a question, and Ethan nodded once, already moving to the console, his fingers gliding across the interface, pulling up external scans that painted the void with thin outlines of distant objects, most of them debris, cold, drifting, but one of them was not. It held position relative to them, adjusting in small increments, matching velocity, maintaining distance just beyond standard visual range. They have been following for at least 12 minutes, Liara added, her gaze fixed on the projection, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before, not fear, but recognition. Ethan did not react to the implication immediately. Instead, he adjusted the ship's output by a fraction, reducing their emission profile, letting the vessel blend more cleanly into the background noise of space, a technique learned from experience rather than training. Do they belong to him? He asked, not needing to specify, because there was only one him that mattered in this context. Liara's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the movement pattern, the precision of it, the restraint. Yes, she said, the word quiet, certain. They do not approach, they do not signal, they observe. That is his method. Ethan leaned back slightly, considering, not the presence itself, but the intention behind it, because intent defined outcome more than capability ever did. Then they are not here for me, he said, almost to himself, and Liara's gaze shifted toward him, sharp, immediate. They are not here for you, she confirmed, and for the first time, there was something beneath her composure that resembled urgency, not in movement, but in thought. The ship continued forward, the distance between them and the unidentified vessel, holding steady at just under 20 miles. A silent equation playing out in the dark. Ethan's hand hovered over the navigation controls, not acting yet, because action without clarity was just reaction, and he did not operate that way. If we change course now, he said slowly, his eyes still on the display. We confirm that we see them. Liara processed that instantly, her posture shifting as she turned fully toward the console, her movements precise, efficient, no wasted motion. If we do not change course, she replied, we confirm that we are going where they expect us to go. The space between those two options settled into silence, not empty, but weighted with consequence. Ethan exhaled quietly, his gaze lifting from the display to the forward viewport, where the stars remained indifferent, unchanged. Then we do neither, he said, his voice steady, and his fingers moved again, adjusting their trajectory by less than a degree, a change small enough to appear incidental, large enough to alter their destination over time. The ship responded with a soft shift in its internal balance, the engines recalibrating without protest. Liara watched the adjustment, her eyes tracking the new vector, calculating the outcome, and then she looked at him, not with surprise, but with something closer to alignment. You are introducing uncertainty into their model, she said, her tone measured, almost approving. Ethan did not smile, did not acknowledge the observation beyond the action itself. I am giving us time, he replied. The unidentified vessel adjusted in response, its position shifting slightly, maintaining the same distance. But its pattern had changed, no longer perfectly mirrored, now reactive, now uncertain. Liara stepped closer to the console, her presence beside him no longer foreign, no longer separate, but integrated into the moment. They will report this, she said, her voice quieter now, but more focused. He will know that I am not where I am supposed to be. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the shifting data, the evolving pattern. Good, he said simply, and for a brief moment, Liara studied him, not the action, not the strategy, but the intent behind it, and what she saw there did not match any system she had been taught to trust. The ship moved forward, no longer just traveling through space, but through a narrowing set of possibilities, each one shaped by choices that neither of them had been allowed to make before, and somewhere behind them, at a distance carefully maintained, something was watching, recalculating, adjusting, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer predictable. The distance did not change, but the meaning of it did. The unidentified vessel no longer mirrored perfectly, its adjustments now slightly delayed, slightly off, like a system trying to recalculate a variable it did not fully understand, and Ethan watched that hesitation with quiet focus, his fingers resting lightly on the console, not moving yet, because every unnecessary action revealed intention. Liara stood beside him, no longer observing from the edges, her presence aligned with his, her gaze fixed on the shifting data as if she could see beyond it, beyond the signal, beyond the distance itself. They are waiting, she said, her voice low, measured, and this time there was no detachment in it, only clarity. Ethan nodded once, his eyes tracing the vector lines, the predicted paths branching outward in thin, glowing arcs. They want confirmation, he replied, and he reached forward, not to evade, not to accelerate, but to do something far less expected. He opened a channel. The system responded with a soft tone, a narrowband transmission extending outward into the dark, precise, controlled, deliberate. Liara turned toward him instantly, her posture tightening by a fraction, not in fear, but in awareness of what that meant. You are revealing our position, she said, not questioning the action, but defining its consequence. Ethan did not look at her, his gaze steady on the transmission indicator as it pulsed once, then held. They already know where we are, he said, quietly, and then, after a brief pause, he added, I want them to know we know they are there. The silence that followed was different, not uncertain, not tense, but sharpened, like a line drawn clearly where before there had only been suggestion. The unidentified vessel responded, not with movement, not with approach, but with a signal of its own, a narrow return frequency that appeared on the console as a clean, structured pattern, unmistakably deliberate. Liara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she read the signal, not as data, but as language. It is a request, she said, her voice quieter now, but carrying weight. They are asking for identification. Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand hovering over the input controls, not answering immediately, because answers defined roles, and roles defined outcomes. And if we do not respond? He asked, his tone even. Liara did not hesitate this time. They will continue to observe until the uncertainty resolves, she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, or until it does not. Ethan considered that, not the words themselves, but the implication behind them, and then he made a choice that shifted everything again. He entered a response, not coded, not concealed, but clear. The transmission left the ship in a single pulse, precise, undeniable. Liara watched the console, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture shifted, something that had not been there before, something closer to ownership then. Reaction: "You are not concealing me," she said. And this time it was not an observation, it was a realization. Ethan shook his head once, a small motion. "No," he said simply. The response from the vessel came faster this time, the pattern sharper, more defined, and Liara's eyes locked onto it instantly, recognition flashing across her features for the first time without restraint. "They acknowledge," she said, her voice steady but no longer distant. "They recognize my designation." The words settled into the space between them, heavy with meaning, because designation was not identity, it was classification. It was the system her father had built, the system that had reduced her to a variable. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the console to the forward viewport, where nothing had changed and everything had. "Then they know you are not where you are supposed to be," he said. Liara's gaze shifted from the signal to the stars beyond, her reflection faint in the glass. Standing, aligned, no longer matching the definition that had once contained her. "Yes," she said quietly, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in it, no distance, only certainty. The ship continued forward, the transmission fading into silence, but the effect remained, because somewhere behind them, a system had just been forced to update, to account for something it had not planned for. And as Liara stood there, no longer hidden, no longer undefined, the path ahead was no longer something being chosen for her. It was something she was beginning to claim. The reply from the distant vessel did not escalate. It did not accelerate. It did not close the distance. It simply held position and changed its behavior, the tracking pattern smoothing into something less reactive and more deliberate, like a system that had reached a conclusion it could not override. Ethan watched the console in silence, his hands no longer hovering over controls, because there was nothing left to adjust. Not mechanically, not tactically. The next move did not belong to him. Liara stood beside him, the frame beneath her humming at a steady frequency, supporting without effort, her posture no longer tentative, no longer defined by adaptation, but by presence, as if the space itself had adjusted to her rather than the other way around. "They will not intervene," she said, her voice calm, certain, not hopeful, not relieved, just precise. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back to the display. "Because of the transmission," he said. Liara shook her head once, a small motion, almost imperceptible. "Because of the response," she corrected, and there was something in that distinction that mattered, something that shifted the entire equation. The ship continued forward, its course now unmistakably leading toward the edge of controlled territory, where jurisdiction blurred and authority depended less on command and more on recognition. The stars ahead did not change, but the meaning behind them did. Because beyond that invisible boundary was not safety, not certainty, but choice, and choice had not been part of Liara's world for a long time. She moved away from the console, her steps smooth, measured, crossing the cargo bay with a confidence that had not existed hours before, the frame responding seamlessly, no longer an aid, but an extension of intent. She stopped near the viewing panel again, looking out into the vast dark, her reflection steady, aligned, whole in a way that had nothing to do with symmetry. "My designation is no longer valid," she said quietly, not to Ethan, not to the ship, but to the space itself, as if stating it made it real. Ethan leaned back against the console, arms resting loosely, watching her without interruption, because this was not something he could build, not something he could fix. This was something she had to define, then define. "Something else," he said, his voice even, unforced, the words offered without weight, without expectation. Liara remained still for a moment, the silence stretching, not empty, but full of recalibration, of systems rewriting themselves without external command. "Names are given," she said slowly, her gaze still on the stars. Titles are assigned, roles are enforced. Ethan did not respond immediately, letting the thought settle, because forcing an answer would only replace one system with another. Then choose what is not given, he said after a moment, his tone steady, grounded. Liara's eyes shifted slightly, not turning fully toward him, but acknowledging the statement, processing it, testing it against everything she had known. Behind them, the distant vessel adjusted once more, not to follow, not to mirror, but to maintain observation at a respectful distance. Its behavior now aligned with recognition rather than control. Liara took a slow breath, the movement subtle but deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something that had not been there before, something unstructured, unassigned. I was designed to inherit, she said, the words measured. Then I was defined as unnecessary. She turned then, fully, facing Ethan, her gaze steady, no longer evaluating, no longer calculating, but deciding. Now I will determine what that inheritance means, she continued. And there was no defiance in her tone, no anger, only clarity, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, because that was all that was required. The ship crossed the boundary moments later. No alarm, no signal, just a subtle shift in the navigation display as controlled space gave way to open jurisdiction. And for the first time since the moment she had been placed on that platform, Liara was not being observed as an asset, not being tracked as a variable. She was simply moving forward. The hum of the ship remained constant, the stars unchanged, but inside that small vessel, something fundamental had shifted beyond repair or reversal, because it had not been built, it had been chosen. And as the distance from her past continued to grow, there was no system left to define her outcome. Only the quiet certainty that whatever came next would no longer be decided for her, and that was enough.